Glasgow does not look like any other British city. It did not begin as a Roman fort, nor as a royal capital, nor as a merchant harbour on the open sea. It began as a small green valley where a monk built a wooden church in the 6th century, on the banks of a little stream called the Molendinar burn. From that stream, 1,500 years of history were stacked layer after layer. A medieval cathedral, a university older than most in the English-speaking world, a merchant class that grew rich on Atlantic trade, the greatest shipbuilding river the world had ever seen, workers' movements that shook the British state, bombs, demolitions, and a reinvention so complete that the city came to be known for a brief moment as the Glasgow Miracle. No single Glasgow outlasts the others. The Green Valley is still there, culverted beneath the streets. The cathedral still stands. The tobacco lords' mansions still line a grid named after Jamaica and Virginia. The shipyard cranes still break the skyline of the Clyde, and the people who built this city, again and again, are still writing its next chapter. This is the entire history of Glasgow. 1,500 years in a single film. This video was made using AI tools to visually reconstruct how Glasgow may have looked across its history. The images are not always perfect, but every fact has been carefully researched. Chapitre 1. The Saint and the Dear Green Place. Environ 540 mots. Around the year 550, a missionary in his mid-20s walked out of a monastery in Fife and followed the banks of the River Clyde west. His birth name was Kentigern. His mother, a monk called Serf, had nicknamed him Mungo, Dear One, when she had arrived at the monastery at Culross, pregnant, cast out, and alone. The land he was walking into was not empty. It belonged to the kingdom of Strathclyde, a Britannic realm whose people spoke a language closer to Welsh than to the Gaelic spoken further north. Christianity had reached the Clyde Valley a generation earlier, carried by missionaries working out of Whithorn on the southern coast. But the faith was fragile, and most of the surrounding countryside still followed older gods. Mungo stopped in a green valley where a small stream, the Molendinar burn, ran down into the River Clyde. He called the place, in the local British tongue, Glasgow, the Dear Green Place. On the low rise above the burn, he built a small wooden church and a cell. For 13 years, he preached to the people of the Clyde. Then a local king, named Morcan, hostile to the new religion, drove him out. Mungo travelled south through Cumbria into Wales and reportedly as far as Rome. Only when a new king, Riddick Hale, invited him back did he return to the valley and to his church. He died there, the Welsh Annals record, on the 13th of January 614. For 4 centuries after his death, the place on the Molendinar remained very small. A cluster of wooden buildings, a graveyard, a community of monks serving pilgrims. The Vikings came up the Clyde in the 9th and 10th centuries, and the settlement survived them. The Strathclyde kingdom weakened and was gradually absorbed into the Kingdom of Scotland around the middle of the 11th century. Still, Glasgow was nothing more than a chapel town. The change came from the south. Around 1115, a young Scottish prince named David, who would later become King David I, reinstated the Diocese of Glasgow and appointed a bishop. Stone replaced wood. A first modest cathedral was consecrated in 1136 in the presence of David himself and his court. 60 years later, after a fire, a second one was built on the same spot and consecrated in 1197. In 1175, Pope Alexander III took the bishopric of Glasgow under his personal protection, declaring it a special daughter of Rome. The decision freed Glasgow from the claims of the Archbishop of York and cemented its independent weight within the Scottish Church. Around the same time, between 1175 and 1178, King William the Lion granted the bishop the right to hold a weekly Thursday market and to run the settlement as a bishop's burgh. A small but real town was beginning to form. By the year 1200, the Dear Green Place on the Molendinar had become a stone town built around a growing cathedral, a saint's shrine, and a river that would one day carry the weight of an empire. But that was still 4 centuries away. For now, Glasgow was small, devout, rainy, and almost entirely unknown beyond the Scottish border. Through the 13th century, the cathedral on the Molendinar grew. Bishop after bishop extended it, rebuilt it, added a lower church to shelter Mungo's tomb, then a new eastern arm to hold his shrine at the main level. The work followed no single plan. Each bishop added what he could afford, and when he died, his successor continued. By 1300, Glasgow Cathedral was one of the largest Gothic buildings in Scotland, an arresting stone mass rising above a small town of wooden houses and muddy lanes. The town itself was still very small. Around 1,500 people lived there along 4 main streets laid out in a rough cross. The high street running down from the cathedral to the Clyde, the Gallowgate and Trongate running east to west, and the Salt Market heading south to the river. It was a place of markets, craftsmen and pilgrims. Glasgow traded hides, wool, salted fish and linen, but its turn was to the west and to Ireland, and the great east coast ports of Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Perth and Dundee did far more business with the continent. In the national burgh tax of 1367, Glasgow paid less than 1% of the total and ranked only 21st. It was the bishop's town, not the king's, and it was not yet wealthy. It was, however, politically alive. When the wars of Scottish independence broke out at the end of the 13th century, the Bishop of Glasgow, Robert Wishart, became one of the leading figures of the Scottish resistance. He backed William Wallace, absolved Robert the Bruce of the murder that should have excommunicated him, and produced the robes and the royal banner from the cathedral's own treasury for Bruce's coronation at Scone on the 25th of March 1306. He was captured by the English twice, first after the failed rising of 1297, then again after the coronation, and spent his final years blind in an English prison, released only after Bannockburn in 1314. His effigy still lies in the cathedral crypt. For a small town on the wrong side of the country, Glasgow had placed its bishop at the very centre of Scotland's fight for independence. The 15th century changed everything for the cathedral and for the town. In 1400, lightning struck the cathedral spire and burnt the wooden steeple down. Successive bishops rebuilt it in stone. In 1450, King James II upgraded Glasgow from a burgh of barony to a burgh of regality, giving it broader trading privileges. And in the following year, the most important decision in the town's medieval history was made in Rome. On the 7th of January, 1451, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull at the request of King James II, authorising the creation of a new university. The bull reached Glasgow on the 20th of June that year, and the first classes were held inside the chapter house of the cathedral itself. Bishop William Turnbull, who had pushed the project through, became the first chancellor. 4 faculties were founded: arts, divinity, law and medicine. The University of Glasgow was the 4th in the English-speaking world after Oxford, Cambridge and St Andrews, and the 2nd oldest in Scotland. The university remained tiny for its first 2 centuries, with only a handful of masters and students. But the town had now acquired the 2 institutions that would define its identity for the next 400 years: a cathedral with a growing shrine and a university with a papal charter. In 1492, Pope Innocent VIII elevated Glasgow to an archbishopric, with jurisdiction over most of the southwest of Scotland. The Deer Green place had become one of the 2 ecclesiastical capitals of the kingdom, and yet, with all of this, Edinburgh was still many times its size. The Reformation arrived in Scotland not as a royal decree, like in England, but as a revolution from below. After decades of Protestant preaching, burnings at the stake, and imported reformist literature, the Scottish Parliament met in Edinburgh in August 1560 and passed 3 acts in a single afternoon. They abolished Catholic worship, rejected papal authority, and adopted a Protestant confession of faith drafted in 4 days by John Knox and 5 collaborators, all of them also called John. The 6 Johns, as they came to be known, had composed a document that would remain the doctrinal standard of the Church of Scotland for nearly a century. Scotland became a Protestant country overnight. In Glasgow, the shift was sudden and total. The last Catholic Archbishop, James Beaton, fled to France within weeks, taking with him the diocesan records, the university mace, the relics of St Mungo, and most of the treasures of the cathedral. He never returned. From 1560 onwards, Glasgow Cathedral was cleansed of its Catholic furnishings, its altars removed, its images stripped, its side chapels walled off. In 1562, a Protestant minister preached the first Reformed sermon inside the building. The cathedral almost did not survive the decade. In 1579, reforming crowds, having already pulled down St Andrew's and many of Scotland's smaller cathedrals for their stone, turned their attention to Glasgow. According to the surviving accounts, the organised trades of the city, the craftsmen of the bakers, weavers, tailors and smiths, took up arms and physically barred the mobs from entering. Glasgow Cathedral was saved not by royal decree, but by its own citizens. With the cathedral at St Magnus in Orkney, it remains one of the only two Scottish medieval cathedrals to have come through the Reformation virtually intact. The political consequences were slower. Glasgow became a royal burgh in 1611, but the Archbishop still controlled the appointment of magistrates. When the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland met at Glasgow Cathedral in November 1638, more than 150 ministers and 100 elders packed into the nave. Glasgow had been chosen over Edinburgh specifically because its smaller population made large-scale rioting less likely. For a fortnight, the Assembly defied the King's Commissioner, refused to dissolve, and on the 8th of December voted to abolish the office of bishop altogether. The Act triggered 15 years of civil war across the three kingdoms of Scotland, England and Ireland, wars in which tens of thousands died. Glasgow itself was briefly occupied by a royalist army but was not sacked. Only in 1690, after William of Orange's invasion had ended Catholic rule in Britain for good, did the town council finally win the right to elect its own provost and magistrates. Glasgow was no longer the Archbishop's town. By then the town was already changing in a different direction. The union of the Scottish and English crowns under James VI and I in 1603 had opened an overland trade in linen with England that quickly became profitable. Between 1600 and 1640, the population of Glasgow almost doubled, from around 7,000 to 12,000. In 1638, the town council backed the first Glasgow manufactory, a weaving workshop set up by the merchant Robert Flaming on Drygate. In 1650, Hutchison's Hospital for Orphans and the Elderly opened its doors. In 1668, the town bought land on the lower Clyde estuary and began to build Port Glasgow, a deep-water port that could take ocean-going ships the upper Clyde could not. In 1674, the first cargo of tobacco arrived on Glasgow's quays from Virginia, along with sugar, in defiance of the English Navigation Acts. Between 1667 and 1700, 4 sugar refineries were built in the town, the first buildings ever dedicated to Atlantic trade in Glasgow. The ships came from Barbados, from Jamaica, from the Virginia coast, and the cargoes they carried were only the beginning. On the 1st of May, 1707, the kingdoms of Scotland and England were merged into a single state, Great Britain. In Glasgow, the news was met not with celebration, but with rioting. Crowds attacked the house of Provost John Aird, broke into the toll booth to seize muskets, and drove the provost to flee to Edinburgh. Order was only restored when dragoons arrived and imposed a night curfew. The Glaswegians believed, rightly, that the union had been pushed through by English pressure and Scottish self-interest. But within a generation, Glasgow would benefit from it more than any other town in Scotland. The Acts of Union opened the English colonies of North America and the Caribbean to Scottish merchants for the first time. The Clyde, facing west across the Atlantic, was better placed for the voyage to Virginia than London, Bristol or Liverpool. Glasgow's ships were built faster and stronger for the crossing. Its merchants set up permanent stores along the rivers of Virginia, Maryland and North Carolina, buying tobacco directly from the planters and advancing them credit against future harvests. It was a ruthless system. By the 1760s, the planters of Maryland and Virginia had accumulated around £1 million of debt to Glasgow firms. George Washington's own estate at Mount Vernon was among them. The tobacco itself was grown by enslaved Africans. It was brought to Glasgow's quays, weighed, stored in the new warehouses of the Trongate, and re-exported to France, Holland, Scandinavia, and the German states. In 1747, the French monarchy granted Glasgow a monopoly on tobacco imports into its territories. By 1760, Glasgow had overtaken London as Britain's main tobacco port. By 1770, 37 Glasgow companies kept over 300 ships busy on the Atlantic, and the town was importing more than £40 million of tobacco a year. The men who ran this trade became the tobacco lords: John Glassford, Alexander Spares, Andrew Buchanan, William Cunningham. They built mansions on the western edge of the old town, along streets they named after the sources of their wealth: Virginia Street, Jamaica Street, Glassford Street, Buchanan Street. Dressed in black silk and scarlet cloaks, carrying gold-tipped canes, they gathered on the Plainstanes, Glasgow's first paved street, outside the Tontine Rooms on the Trongate. They called themselves the Princes of the Pavement. Everyone else had to step aside, and then, in 1775, the ocean turned against them. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, Glasgow's tobacco trade collapsed almost overnight. Warehouses on the Trongate stood empty. Firms went bankrupt. John Glassford himself died in debt in 1783, ruined by losses in Virginia. But the city did not collapse with the tobacco lords. The capital, the ships, the warehouses, and the Atlantic connections were redeployed into new industries. Within a generation, Glasgow had reinvented itself as the engineering workshop of the British Empire. The first piece of the transformation had already fallen into place before the war. In 1765, a young instrument maker at the University of Glasgow called James Watt was walking across a Glasgow green when he understood how to make a steam engine work. The Newcomen engine of the early 18th century wasted most of its heat reheating the same cylinder over and over. Watt's idea was to condense the steam in a separate chamber. He patented the invention in 1769, moved to Birmingham in 1774, and with his business partner Matthew Boulton began producing engines that would power cotton mills, coal mines, and ironworks across Britain. The age of steam began, in effect, in a park on the banks of the Clyde. The river itself was the second piece. In 1768, the engineer John Goulburn proposed to narrow the Clyde with long stone jetties, so that the river would scour its own bed. Between Dumbuck and the Broomielaw Quay, in the centre of Glasgow, hundreds of jetties were built. In 1773, a training wall called the Lang Dyke blocked the southern channel at Dumbarton and forced the full flow of the river through the main course. Where before ocean ships had been forced to unload at Port Glasgow, they could now sail all the way up to the city. By 1800, the new streets west of the old town were lined with cotton mills powered by Boulton and Watt engines. Cotton imported from the West Indies and the American South was spun and woven in Glasgow's factories, then re-exported across Europe and the Empire. By 1831, more than 100 steam-powered mills were running in the city alone. Glasgow had entered its machine age. In 1812, a Helensburgh hotelier named Henry Bell launched the Comet, the first commercially successful steamship in Europe. The hull had been built on the lower Clyde at Port Glasgow. The engine and boiler had been built in Glasgow itself. It was a small boat, 40 feet long, running between Glasgow, Greenock and Helensburgh 3 times a week, but it started something that would last for more than a century. By 1819, there were 25 steamships on the Clyde. By mid-century, shipyards lined the river from Govan and Partick in the centre of the city down through Whiteinch, Scottstown and Clydebank. In the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, more than 30,000 ships would be built on the Clyde, around a fifth of the world's total shipping. The word Clyde built became a global byword for quality. Shipbuilding pulled everything else behind it. Coal from Lanarkshire, iron from the new ironworks. In 1828, a Glasgow engineer named James Beaumont Nielsen patented the hot blast furnace, which tripled the iron yield per tonne of coal and made raw Scottish coal profitable for smelting. Scotland's iron industry tripled in a generation. Locomotives, marine engines, sugar mills, dredging ploughs, a dense network of engineering workshops in Springburn and Govan supplied parts for machines running from India to Argentina. Glasgow began to call itself, with only slight exaggeration, the workshop of the world. The population grew faster than almost any other city in Europe. From around 77,000 in 1801, Glasgow passed 250,000 by the start of the Victorian era and 500,000 by 1871. Highlanders cleared from their lands, Irish families driven out by the Great Famine, workers from all over Scotland and beyond poured into the Gorbals, the Calton, the East End. They crowded into tenements 5 and 6 stories high. Cholera struck the city in 1832, 1848 and 1853, killing thousands. In 1855, Parliament authorised a scheme to bring fresh water from Loch Katrina, 40 kilometres to the north. 4 years later, in October 1859, Queen Victoria opened the sluice. The aqueduct still supplies the city today. By 1890, Glasgow was calling itself the second city of the empire, and for a generation the claim was true. By the turn of the 20th century, Glasgow was one of the richest cities in the world. Its wealth was visible on every street of the city centre. The city chambers on George Square, opened by Queen Victoria in August 1888, were the most expensive public building in Britain outside London, their marble staircase rising 3 stories through a blaze of gold leaf and mosaic. The same year, the city hosted its first international exhibition in Kelvingrove Park, drawing more than 5 million visitors. The profits were used to build a new museum. When the Kelvingrove Art Gallery opened in 1901 as the Palace of Fine Arts of the Second International Exhibition, 11.5 million visitors came through its doors in 6 months. On the east side of the city, the People's Palace had opened in January 1898 on Glasgow Green, a museum and winter garden built explicitly as a cultural centre for the poor of the East End. Underneath all of this, the infrastructure had caught up with the population. On the 14th of December 1896, the Glasgow subway opened. It was the third underground railway in the world, after London and Budapest, and it was cable-hauled. 9 million passengers rode it in its first year. 2 years later, the first electric tramways replaced the old horse-drawn lines, knitting the new suburbs of the West End and the South Side to the city centre. And at Renfrew Street, a young architect was building something that would outlast the rest of it. Charles Rennie Mackintosh, working for the firm of Honeyman and Keppie, won the 1896 competition to design a new Glasgow School of Art. The first phase was completed in 1899, the second, with its extraordinary library, between 1907 and 1909. Mackintosh had invented a new visual language, drawing on Scottish baronial architecture, Japanese print and arts and crafts restraint, but reshaped into something no one had seen before. The Glasgow style would influence European modernism for 30 years. By 1911, the city's population had passed 784,000. A fifth of all ships launched in the world still came off the Clyde yards. The warehouses were full, and the second city of the empire seemed unshakable. Within 3 years, Europe would be at war, and Glasgow would not come out of it the same city. The First World War brought the Clyde yards their busiest years ever, but the city that came out of the war was not the city that had entered it. In 1915, with munitions workers flooding in and rents rising, 15,000 Glasgow tenants, led by a housewife named Mary Barber, refused to pay. The government backed down and imposed nationwide rent controls. In 1919, with the war over and soldiers returning to find no jobs, engineering and shipyard workers called a strike for a 40-hour week. On the 31st of January, more than 60,000 workers filled George Square to hear the Lord Provost's reply. The demonstration turned into a riot, the red flag was raised, 53 people were injured. Fearing a workers' revolution on the model of Russia, the British government sent 10,000 English troops and 6 tanks north to Glasgow. Scottish soldiers were kept in their barracks. A compromise 47-hour week was agreed within a week. The episode was remembered as Bloody Friday, and the decades of militancy that followed as Red Clydeside. Then came the long decline. The interwar depression hit Glasgow harder than almost any other British city. Shipyards idled. By 1933, unemployment in the city had reached 30%. The Second World War gave the yards a brief reprieve, but it also brought catastrophe. on the nights of the 13th and 14th of March 1941, 439 Luftwaffe bombers targeted the John Brown shipyard and the Singer factory at Clydebank. 528 people died in the town itself, more than 600 more in Glasgow. Of 12,000 houses in Clydebank, only 7 were left undamaged. 35,000 people were made homeless in 2 nights. After the war, global shipbuilding moved to Germany, Japan, and later Korea. Britain's share fell from nearly half the world's ships in 1950 to 6% by 1964. 5 Upper Clyde yards were merged into a single company in 1968. When it went into liquidation in 1971, the shop stewards, led by Jimmy Reed and Jimmy Early, refused to strike. Instead, they occupied the yards and kept building the ships. The work in won, 2 yards were saved, but the industry that had defined Glasgow for a century and a half was finished. For most of the 1970s and early 1980s, Glasgow was a byword for post-industrial decline. The shipyards emptied. The tenements of the Gorbals and the Calton were pulled down, their residents moved to tower blocks on the edge of the city or to the new towns of East Kilbride and Cumbernauld. In the foreign press, Glasgow meant violence, no mean city, bad health, bad weather. In 1983, the City Council launched an advertising campaign with the slogan, "Glasgow's miles better." Few outside the city took it seriously. 3 years later, the European Commission announced that Glasgow had been chosen as European City of Culture for 1990, following Athens, Amsterdam, Berlin, Paris and Florence. The choice astonished almost everyone. But when the year arrived, the city put on more than 3,000 public events, opened new galleries and welcomed millions of visitors. Tourism quadrupled between 1982 and 1990. By the mid-1990s, Glasgow-based artists were winning Turner Prizes. The Tate curator Hans Ulrich Obrist called what was happening in the city the Glasgow Miracle. The phrase stuck. The physical city followed. Along the Clyde, the derelict docks and shipyards of Govan Pacific Quay and Glasgow Harbour were redeveloped. The Scottish Exhibition and Conference Centre opened on the old Queen's Dock site. The Glasgow Science Centre rose on the former Garden Festival grounds. In 2007, BBC Scotland moved its headquarters to Pacific Quay, anchoring a new media quarter beside the river. The Commonwealth Games of 2014, staged in a rebuilt East End, drew 6,500 athletes and watched the Red Road flats, scheduled for demolition, almost included in the opening ceremony before public outcry stopped it. Glasgow today is not the Glasgow of 1900, and it will never be again. The shipyards are gone, with only 2 surviving on the river. The tenements have been replaced, but the Deer Green place is still there, culverted beneath the High Street. The cathedral still stands. The university, 900 years old next century, still teaches. And the people of Glasgow, having built and rebuilt this city through 15 centuries of saints, tobacco lords, ship riveters and artists, are still writing its next chapter.